"That's my dad's book," the little girl said softly. "So why is it in your car?" The words stopped him cold. Richard Vale, billionaire author, media darling, the man whose words built empires, suddenly had none. Across the marble foyer stood a 10-year-old black girl in a faded pink hoodie, clutching a torn notebook like treasure. Her name was Dana Caldwell. Her eyes held no anger, only truth. And that truth had just cracked open the foundation of everything he'd built. Because the book she was pointing at, his best-selling masterpiece, The Light Between Two Storms, wasn't his at all. What he didn't know was that this quiet confrontation would become the moment that tore down his billionaire lie and gave a forgotten man's name the justice it deserved. This is Hidden Black Echoes, where the stories of struggles are told, the rise and the voice of those the world tried to silence. If you believe truth doesn't fade even when power tries to bury it, hit like and subscribe. Because many times conscience speaks louder than wealth, and justice always finds its way home, no matter how long it hides. "That's my dad's book," the little girl said softly. "So why is it in your car?" The words stopped Richard Vale cold. And that question cut deeper than any insult ever could. The notebook's title glimmered faintly in the light, streaming from the grand chandelier. The Light Between Two Storms. He knew that title better than his own name. It was the book that made him rich, the one that had bought the mansion, the cars, the awards, the one that wasn't truly his. For a moment he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, as if the walls themselves were waiting for his answer. Behind the girl stood a tall woman, calm, composed, protective, Nora Williams, the girl's caretaker. She stepped forward gently. "Dana, honey, what are you talking about?" The girl, Dana Caldwell, didn't take her eyes off Richard. "When we came in, I saw the same book in his car. My dad wrote that book before he died." Her words hit the air like a glass shattering. Nora blinked, confused. "Sweetheart, maybe it just looks the same." "No," Dana interrupted softly, shaking her head. "He used to read it to me every night. Even the title is the same, The Light Between Two Storms. He said one day everyone would read it." Richard felt the ground tilt beneath him. His hands trembled, hidden in the pockets of his perfectly tailored suit. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I think you must be mistaken, young lady. I wrote that book many years ago." Dana tilted her head, studying him the way only a child could, without fear, without politeness, just truth. Her voice was small, but her words were steady. "Then why does your version have my dad's name written on the first page?" The air went still. Even the soft hum of the chandelier seemed to fade. Nora's brow furrowed. "Dana, what did you say?" "The name," Dana whispered. "Daddy's name, Elliot Caldwell. He wrote it inside in blue pen, just like he always did." Richard's heart began to race. He could feel it pounding in his ears. He hadn't opened that old notebook in years, not since he'd locked it away like a piece of his guilt. But the copy in his car. Yes, that one had writing inside. He told himself it didn't matter, that no one would ever notice. Until now. He forced a laugh that came out thin and brittle. "I'm sure you're mistaken," he said quickly. "That notebook must be a coincidence." But Dana didn't smile. She simply held the book tighter. "My dad said the man who took it would feel empty forever." The line struck him like lightning, clean, sharp, unmerciful. Nora noticed his expression shift, the way his confidence cracked, the sudden glassy look in his eyes. She placed a protective arm around Dana and said carefully, "Mr. Vale, I think we've taken enough of your time." He nodded absently, but his voice barely worked. Yes, of course." They turned to leave, their footsteps soft against the marble. But before she stepped through the doorway, Dana glanced back once more, her little voice breaking the silence. "Maybe you can tell me next time why Daddy's book has your name on it." Then she was gone. Richard stood frozen in the doorway long after the sound of their car faded down the hill. He walked slowly to the window, staring out at his driveway where his Bentley waited, sleek, black, untouchable. And there, on the passenger seat, through the glass, lay the same tattered notebook, same blue handwriting on the inside cover, same title etched across the front, same truth he'd buried 20 years ago. He pressed a trembling hand to the glass and whispered to himself, "What have I done?" The reflection that stared back wasn't a billionaire. It wasn't an author, it was a thief. And the past was finally knocking on his door. Richard Vale stood by the window long after Nora's car disappeared down the drive. The reflection staring back at him felt unfamiliar. For the first time in years, the face of success looked hollow. He turned away abruptly, but his chest still tightened with the echo of that little girl's voice. "Why is my dad's book in your car?" Those words looped in his head like a sentence he couldn't escape. Downstairs, the sound of muffled laughter reached him. Nora and Dana hadn't left yet. The driver was delayed, and the housekeeper had invited them to wait in the parlor. Richard straightened his jacket, steadying his breath. He couldn't let emotion show. Not here, not in his own home. He descended the grand staircase, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the bottom, Nora stood near the piano, watching Dana trace her fingers along the keys. The little girl smiled faintly. "It sounds like rain," she said softly, pressing a single note. Nora chuckled. "Maybe that's why your dad liked playing." Richard's hand froze on the banister. "Her dad played piano too?" He glanced toward the corner of the room. His late wife's piano, the same one where, decades ago, he'd first heard Elliot Caldwell play that same melody. "Mr. Vale?" Nora's voice pulled him back. He cleared his throat, forcing composure. "Would you two care for something to drink while you wait?" Nora smiled politely. "That's kind of you." Dana wandered over to a nearby bookshelf, scanning the rows of framed awards and leather-bound first editions. Her gaze stopped at a photo. Richard, smiling at a book launch, the light between two storms displayed proudly beside him. "Wow," she whispered. "My dad had that picture in our house too." Richard turned sharply. "What did you say?" Dana pointed. "That same picture. Only in ours, it's just my dad standing next to that same book cover." Nora frowned. "Dana, honey." But Richard's pulse was already pounding. He took a step closer, his voice uneven. He had this same cover?" Dana nodded innocently. "Yeah, he said it was the book that would change everything." For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence between them felt thick, almost sacred, like something heavy was about to crack open. Nora glanced at Richard's face, reading what he didn't say. His usual confidence was gone. All that remained was the uneasy flicker of guilt. When Dana walked off toward the sitting room, Nora lowered her voice. "Mr. Vale," she said quietly, "you knew her father, didn't you?" Richard's eyes darted away. "No," he said too quickly. "No, I didn't." Nora folded her arms. She said he was a writer, that he passed before the book was published. You don't think that's strange? The same title, the same handwriting, the same dedication? He didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. Nora's voice softened. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. But I know the look of a man carrying something heavy. And right now, you're drowning in it. Richard's jaw clenched. You don't understand. Then help me, she said simply. A loud crash cut through the room. Dana had dropped a framed award from the shelf. I'm sorry, she cried, bending down. The glass had cracked diagonally across the gold plate. Pulitzer Prize for Literature. Richard Vale, The Light Between Two Storms, dedicated to my daughter Grace. Dana stared at it for a moment. Then she whispered, My dad said that was his title. And his dedication. The child's innocent words hit him like lightning. He could see it all. The old apartment, the worn desk, Elliot sitting across from him, typing the last line of the manuscript. The smell of coffee. The sound of laughter. The night Elliot handed him the notebook and said, If anything happens to me, promise you'll make sure people read it. And he had. But not with Elliot's name. Richard turned away, gripping the edge of the fireplace mantel. His knuckles whitened. Nora stepped closer. So it's true. He didn't look at her, but his voice came out raw. He died the next week. I told myself I was honoring him, that the world needed the book more than it needed a name. I convinced myself it was fate. Nora's tone was calm but piercing. And it never felt like theft? He flinched. Every single day. Dana re-entered the room, holding her father's notebook, the one she'd dropped earlier. She smiled faintly, unaware of the storm building around her. Mr. Vale, she said softly, when my dad was sick, he said stories never die. They just wait for the right person to tell them. Maybe he meant you. Her words landed like forgiveness wrapped in innocence. But Richard couldn't accept them, not yet. He turned away, his voice trembling. Excuse me, he murmured, disappearing down the hallway toward his study. The heavy door closed behind him with a quiet click. Inside the study, he pulled the old notebook from the drawer, the same one with Elliot's handwriting, the same words that had built his empire. He opened to the first page, tracing the familiar ink. For my daughter, Dana. So she'll always remember that storms pass, but light endures. A tear hit the paper. Then another. Outside the study door, Nora watched silently. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. Because she knew. The truth had finally found its way home. The rain came without warning. By the time night fell, thunder rolled across the city like distant grief. Richard sat alone in his study, the only light a flickering desk lamp reflecting off the wet glass of the window. In front of him, 2 books lay open, one bound in worn leather, the other a glossy bestseller bearing his name. They told the same story, word for word. He stared at them until the lines blurred. His chest felt tight, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the old notebook again. The pages smelled faintly of dust and memory. Every word belonged to Elliot Caldwell, a man the world had forgotten, but whose story had built Richard's fame, his fortune, and his legacy. And now, Elliot's daughter was here. A soft knock sounded at the door. Richard didn't answer, but after a pause, the door creaked open anyway. Nora stepped in quietly, umbrella still dripping rainwater. You didn't come out for dinner, she said gently. Richard didn't look up. I wasn't hungry. Her eyes drifted to the open books. She walked closer, seeing the mirrored paragraphs, the identical sentences. Then she whispered, "So it's true." He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep, heavy with years of silence. "It's worse than you think." Nora took a seat across from him, hands folded. "Then tell me." If this moment moved you. Take a second to like this video and subscribe for more stories where hearts change faster than fortunes ever could. Your support helps us keep sharing voices that deserve to be heard. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat felt raw, like his own voice would accuse him. But then he started, slowly, painfully. "I met Elliot Caldwell 20 years ago. I was broke, desperate, and pretending to be a writer. He had a story, a beautiful one. He said it was inspired by his daughter. We worked on it together for months, side by side in a cafe that smelled like burnt coffee and rain. He stared at the window as lightning flashed. Then one night, he didn't show up. I found out he'd collapsed on the street on his way home. Heart failure. The manuscript was in my bag. And when the news came, He swallowed hard. I told myself finishing the book was what he would have wanted. But when the publisher asked for a name, I hesitated. Then I didn't." Nora listened in silence. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. "Every time I looked at the cover, I told myself it was tribute. But it wasn't. It was theft dressed as honor." The storm outside deepened. The wind rattled the windows, matching the chaos inside his mind. Nora finally spoke. "And Dana?" "She doesn't know," he said quickly. "She just remembers him as a man who wrote stories no one read. She doesn't know that her father's story made me rich." Nora's expression softened. "You've carried that weight for a long time." He gave a broken laugh. "Wait? It became my life. Every award, every speech, every fan who said my book changed them, they were all clapping for a lie." Nora leaned forward. "Then stop hiding behind guilt. Do something with it." Her tone wasn't judgmental. It was steady, like a compass pointing north. Richard looked at her, the exhaustion etched into his face. "You really think redemption is possible for a man who built his world on someone else's name?" Nora didn't blink. "I've seen people rebuild with less than that. But first, you have to face the ones you hurt." He looked down at the notebook again. His hand trembled as he brushed the corner of the page. The dedication to Dana, the one he'd tried so hard to forget. For a long time, the only sound was the rain. Then Richard spoke again, his voice low but certain. "She's just a little girl. She doesn't deserve to carry this story." Nora shook her head gently. "She already is. Every time she asks why her dad's book was in your car, she's reaching for the truth. The least you can do is give it to her." Her words pierced him deeper than any accusation could. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing for a brief moment. The memory of Elliot's laughter filled the silence, that same warm laugh that used to echo over typewriter keys. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet. "Tomorrow?" Richard said quietly. "I'll tell her. Both of them." Nora studied his face, not as a critic or a caretaker, but as someone who had seen broken men before and watched them find their way back. She nodded. "Good. Because if you don't, the truth will find her anyway. And it'll hurt worse when it does." Richard gave a small, pained smile. "You sound like someone who's carried her own ghosts." Nora looked away, her eyes dimming. We all do, Mr. Vale. But some of us decide when to stop letting them lead. With that, she stood and walked towards the door. Before leaving, she glanced back at him, the once proud author hunched over a stranger's story. Tomorrow, she repeated softly. When the door closed behind her, Richard turned once more to the notebook. He placed it beside the copy of his book and whispered, "I'm sorry, old friend." Outside, the rain began to ease. The storm, for the first time in years, was finally breaking. Morning came quietly. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled of rain, fresh, clean, forgiving. Richard Vale stood at the foot of the grand staircase, a coffee mug trembling in his hands. He hadn't slept. The house that once felt like a monument to his success now seemed hollow, every polished surface echoing with the weight of what he had to do. From the living room came the faint hum of a cartoon. Dana sat cross-legged on the rug, her small hands clutching a crayon, coloring a sun that shone brighter than the real one outside. Nora stood nearby, folding a blanket over the couch, her movements calm, her presence grounding. She caught Richard's nervous glance and gave a small nod. The moment had come. Richard set the mug down and knelt beside Dana. His voice was soft, uncertain. "Dana, sweetheart, can I talk to you for a second?" She looked up, curious, her big brown eyes blinking. "Am I in trouble?" He managed a faint smile. "No, honey." "Not at all." Nora sat on the armchair, quietly watching. Richard took a slow breath, trying to find the words. "You remember that book you found in my car?" Her head tilted. "Daddy's book?" He nodded. "Yes, that one." Dana's expression brightened. "Did you like it?" "Mommy said Daddy wrote stories that made people cry." Richard's throat tightened. "He did. He wrote stories that made people feel something. Your daddy was a very special man." She smiled proudly. "I know. He told me stories every night. The one about the bird who lost his wings? That's my favorite." Richard's eyes glistened. "Mine too." Nora watched him closely, every flicker of hesitation, every tremor of guilt. Then Richard continued, his voice shaking. "Dana, the truth is, the book that made me famous, it wasn't mine. It was your dad's. He wrote it, every word." For a moment, Dana just blinked, confused. "You mean Daddy's book? The one with your name on it?" Richard nodded slowly. "Yes, I took it after he passed. I told myself I was finishing it for him, but I didn't give him credit. I let the world think it was mine." The room went still. Even the sound of the television faded into nothing. Dana stared at him, her small brow furrowed. "Why would you do that?" Richard's voice broke. "Because I was selfish. Because I wanted to matter. But it was wrong. And I'm sorry, Dana, for what I did to your father, and for not being brave enough to tell the truth sooner." She looked down at her coloring book. Her tiny hands clenched the crayon tighter until it snapped. Nora rose quietly and knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes adults make mistakes that take a long time to fix," she said softly. "But what matters is that he's trying now." Dana's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, slow and small. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out the old notebook, Elliot Caldwell's original manuscript. He placed it on the coffee table. The faded cover caught the morning light. "This belongs to you," he said. It's your father's story. I want the world to know that now. I'm going to tell them. Nora looked at him with quiet respect. Not for the man he'd been, but for the one finally trying to stand up straight. Dana touched the notebook gently, her fingers tracing her father's name. "He'd be happy you remembered him," she whispered. Richard closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, breathed without shame. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the windows. The truth had finally stepped into the light. The auditorium was full. Reporters lined the aisles, cameras ready, the low buzz of whispered curiosity filling the air. For years, Richard Vale's book readings were elegant affairs, champagne, applause, the self-assured rhythm of a man worshipped for his words. But today felt different. The banners behind him no longer read "The Light Between Two Storms" by Richard Vale. They simply said, "A Story Reborn." On stage, a single podium stood under the warm wash of stage lights. Richard approached it slowly, the manuscript, Elliot Caldwell's manuscript, tucked under his arm. His once impeccable confidence was gone. In its place was a quiet resolve. Nora sat in the front row, hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her, Dana swung her feet gently, clutching the same notebook she had found in his car. When the murmurs finally faded, Richard cleared his throat. His voice trembled at first, but he didn't hide it. "Thank you all for being here. I have something I need to say, something I should have said a long time ago." Cameras flashed. Pens hovered above notepads. He glanced toward Nora and Dana, anchors in a storm he had created. Then he took a breath. "The truth is," he said, "the story that made me famous, the one that built my career, was never truly mine." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters leaned forward, eager, sensing a scandal. Richard continued. Steady now. The author of The Light Between Two Storms was a man named Elliot Caldwell, a writer, a father, and the kind of soul this world doesn't see enough of. He trusted me once, and I failed him. A hush fell over the room. Even the clicking cameras seemed to stop. Richard's gaze drifted down to the notebook in his hands, the worn edges soft from years of use. Elliot wrote stories about hope in dark places, about light that doesn't fade. I took that light and used it to make myself shine. And for that, to his memory, and to his daughter sitting here today, I am deeply sorry. His voice broke. He paused, composing himself. From this day on, all rights, royalties, and recognition for The Light Between Two Storms will belong to the Caldwell family. Every future edition will bear his name, because the truth deserves to live in the open, even if it costs you everything. The audience was silent, not out of politeness, but reverence. Then one person began to clap. It was Nora. Her hands moved slowly at first, then with strength, conviction. Soon others followed, hesitant at first, then building until the hall was filled with applause, not the applause of adoration, but of respect for a man brave enough to tell the truth. Richard stepped back from the podium, tears threatening but controlled. He looked at Dana. She wasn't smiling, but there was something gentler in her expression, an understanding far older than her years. She held her father's book close, whispering softly as if to him, "Daddy, he told them." The words hit Richard like grace. After the event, when the crowd had thinned and reporters clustered around the exits, Dana and Nora approached the stage. Richard knelt as Dana climbed the steps. She held out the notebook, her small hands steady. "Daddy would have liked you telling the truth," she said. "He always said stories are only good if they're honest." Richard smiled through the tears. He was right. She hesitated, then asked, "Does this mean his name will be on the book now?" "Yes," Richard said. "Forever." Dana smiled, a quiet, content smile, the kind that said forgiveness wasn't a word, but a choice. Nora placed a gentle hand on Richard's shoulder. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "you did something most people never do. You faced yourself." He looked up at her, gratitude shining in his eyes. "I only wish I'd done it sooner." Outside the hall, the sunlight poured over the marble steps. The press waited, but for once, Richard didn't rush toward them. He stood for a moment at the doors, watching Dana skip ahead, her pink hoodie bright against the gray cityscape. For years, he had written about redemption without ever living it. But now, watching that little girl, the daughter of the man he wronged, walk into a world that finally knew her father's name, Richard Vale felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Peace. That night, long after the lights dimmed and the world moved on to the next headline, a delivery arrived at a modest home across town. A single box addressed to the Caldwell family. Inside was the first newly printed copy of The Light Between Two Storms. The cover gleamed. The author's name read Elliot Caldwell. And beneath it, in smaller print, a single dedication line that read, "For Dana, who reminded me that the truth never dies." If stories like this remind you that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but owning it with truth and humility, then hit like and subscribe, so you don't miss more stories like this where dignity rises above deceit and grace speaks louder than guilt.